I think I want to start with a line from Mary Oliver this morning. She says, I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I don't know exactly what a prayer is, but I do know how to kneel. And this line of Mary Oliver's I find alluring and rich and also elusive. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. And I agree. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. And that's what I want to talk about today. And that's what I want to talk about this month. Welcome to C3. We're an inclusive spiritual community here in West Michigan. My name is Kent Dobson. And those of you who join us regularly know that we're in the middle of a year-long series where each month we take a look at a different word that we think is important. It's important to be in dialogue with. Last month was paradox. And this month begins prayer. And prayer gives me trouble. And in many ways, it's been giving me trouble since I was a little kid. And so I guess just personally, I want to wrestle with the word again. And I have to be honest, at this point in my life, in my 40s, in my own spiritual practice, I'm not quite at home with a word like prayer. I would not say I have a prayer life or a regular prayer life. So you might wonder, well, why are you talking about it? And part of the answer is because there's something there. There's something that won't leave me alone personally when it comes to a word like prayer and what I think prayer might be inviting us to. So personally, it won't leave me alone, but I also think collectively, especially in an age and an era where if we just look at the statistics, so many people are leaving organized religion. Well, what does that mean? And replacing it with what? And what happens to something like prayer? What happens to something like prayer when your ideas about God shift or change or morph or melt or evolve or dissolve, for that matter? So I just want you to hear again Mary Oliver's line. I don't know exactly what a prayer is, but I do know how to kneel. And that second line gives me trouble. It's like the first part, I agree. I don't know what a prayer is. I don't know exactly what a prayer is, but I do know how to kneel. Part of me even resists that. Maybe I don't want to kneel. You know, it's like the 12-step program to surrender to some kind of higher power as you understand it. That shatters the ego. Who wants to do that? Who wants to kneel like that? So that's what I want to talk about. I want to talk a bit about prayer. And what I want to do today is kind of do a brief history. And I have a definition, and this is honestly a complete working definition. And those of you who join us regularly know that just following this talk, every week we have something called Talk Back, where we get together on Zoom and we talk about what did we hear and what does it bring up for us. And I always get fresh ideas, and the dialogue is lively and interesting and rich and fruitful. And so I think it will be this week. How would you define prayer would be a question. And even if I'm honest, that makes me bristle, it just in the sense of my definition, because prayer kind of walks a line between what's personal and what's personally meaningful and what's collective, what's been collectively meaningful. Of course, there are personal prayers and collective prayers. There are personal prayers and communal prayers. So maybe that's a challenge to you. I'm going to read my definition, and I'm not claiming it's a great one, but I'll read my definition just to put my cards on the table. This is what I think prayer is. And maybe I'm already ahead of myself, that maybe prayer is something that you have to live into. You discover what it is by engaging in it in a kind of authentic exploration, and then maybe later you create a definition. Maybe that's one of the things that's given me trouble. I want to know what it is on the front end. And I'll probably throw in bits and pieces of my own story, maybe as the month goes on, or as I try to at least a little bit in my teachings and talks. But I can remember as a little kid being troubled by prayer, because back then, in a kind of Christian fundamentalism I grew up in, I heard a lot of stories about praying and prayers and answers to prayer, and in a kind of genuine and I think sincere way, I wanted to believe that God listens. And in some ways, I think I did believe that. But so much of prayer was mixed up with wish granting. And maybe that's is part of a childhood imagination. And maybe it's always been that way, and maybe it will always be that way. It's the child that wishes for something on Christmas morning, and it's like almost impossible not to think about God that way, especially when you first, as a kid, bump into trouble and suffering, and a grandparent is sick, or a friend's not doing well, or just more simply, you want something. You desire a new bike or whatever. I don't know. And I think my conception of prayer early on was a little like a vending machine. And I've said that before. I think I probably wrote a line like that in my book, Bitten by a Camel. I don't know. If not, I did and then deleted it. And I probably said it with more bite than I'm saying it right now. Because as it strikes me now, it was relatively innocent. And I think even among my Christian fundamentalist subculture, it was also kind of innocent. Hey, God is, listens. He's our Father, or Jesus is our friend, and he desires a relationship, and that's kind of what prayer is. So I think I've softened on my own sort of bitterness toward my upbringing in many respects. And concerning a vending machine God, it's like, yeah, you plug in the right change. And for me, that was, well, you got to be living right, can't have too many sins. and there is something to that, like, all right, I want to order my life in a certain way. And if I do so, maybe there'll be some benefit or reward or acknowledgement. And in some ways, even if you take God out of it, you want to think in terms of karma. If that resonates with you, it's often like that. Yeah, you do need to get things in line. It seems unfair to ask God for things, and but you're not willing to lift a finger, sort of thing, or you're not attempting to live in an honorable way, you could say. So that's kind of my early conception of childhood, but of childhood prayer, I suppose. But the vending machine bothered me theologically, of course, as I grew up, and I'm sure as it bothers many of you, and I think many even strong believers inside various faiths, it gives them trouble too. Is that the way the universe works? We're going to find just the right change and we put it into the machine and out comes. No, that gives us trouble. So what is prayer? I mean, is it wish granting? And the first thing I'd like to say is probably not. Probably not. So here's my definition, and then I'm gonna attempt something, which I'm going to call a brief history of prayer. So here's my definition: an intentional act taken by an individual or community to align oneself in relationship to the divine or the transcendent. An intentional action taken by an individual or community meant to align oneself in relationship to the divine or the transcendent. To me, a slightly healthier guess about prayer has to do with alignment. What kind of, how do I align myself in relationship with the divine, the transcendent, the mystery? That's actually what I think prayer is. And by that, I mean certain actions, the act of aligning oneself. Maybe here's another way of saying it: an intentional action taken by an individual or community meant to orient oneself in relationship to the divine or the transcendent. It's like sort of saying posture. Prayer might be more like a posture. And if you look at the world's religions, I'm not an expert, I did study comparative religion in graduate school. That was really more focused on Judaism and Christianity and a little bit of Islam. Much of even how people think of prayer globally among religions has to do with posture. You can even right now think of postures associated with various religions. What does a Jewish posture look like, or Islamic, or a Christian posture? See, it's not that far off what I'm trying to say about an action or a series of actions that helps align oneself or posture oneself in relationship to the divine and transcendent, to God, to the mystery. And still, I'd like to say, I don't know exactly what a prayer is. And Mary Oliver says, but I do know how to kneel. See, that's a posture. It's an existential posture, but it's also physical. And to kneel is to be low to the earth and to humble oneself and to pay attention. That's actually what she says after that, I believe. I can't remember the poem just off the top of my head right now. I do not know exactly what a prayer is, but I do know how to kneel. I think she says how to pay attention, how to kneel down in the grass. And maybe attention is a word we can add to a working definition of prayer. So today, I'm going to use some of my academic background to talk a bit about a brief history of prayer. Only because, not that I'm claiming to be some kind of authority, I'm really not, and I told you it gives me trouble. So, but I think it's important to ask, well, how have we conceived of something like prayer? How has it been done? How have these acts or actions been practiced through time in various ways? And of course, this is a brief history, and my area of expertise is narrow. I don't know as much about global religions or spiritualities or very much about indigenous ways of praying that are on the margins of mainstream religion. So I'll admit I have some limitations here, but my goal is really just to dance around certain questions and maybe even come up with themes. Are there themes that can help us approach prayer? And you might say to yourself right now, why would we still be talking about this? Let's move on. After all, we have Twitter, And that's actually modern life and its relentless grip it has on our attention and on what's important, and the urgency of our culture's words only enhances a kind of intuition or suspicion I have that prayer might be more important now than ever. Even if you don't believe in God, you could say, or you don't believe in a personal God, or you don't believe in a vending machine God. And so, okay, let's broaden what we mean by God, or let's broaden what we mean by prayer. Because a posture that is in a kneeling posture to the mysteries of life seems needed now. And to the mystery of our fellow brothers and sisters around the globe, and to the mysteries of the migration of the monarch and the mysteries of the tides of the ocean, and even the mysteries of science as we peer deeper and deeper into the telescope. Without prayer as a posture, as aligning oneself in relationship to the transcendent, to the mystery, then the universe becomes very cold and material. The wind right now is blowing in my garage. It just felt like, I don't know, it felt sort of strange, like all of a sudden this gust of wind. And wind was not too far off of how people thought of prayers. That the winds would carry their prayers, and the smoke was a physical rising up of prayer. So anyway, I'm getting a little down a rabbit hole here. So let's back up. What do we mean by prayer? What's a brief history of prayer? So the oldest markings we have that seem to be something like a prayer are the cave paintings of our ancestors. And particularly the ones I have in my mind right now are these beautiful cave paintings in France. There's Werner Herzog has a lovely documentary on this that you should, I was going to say you should stop watching this and start, okay, finish this and then go watch the documentary. But what's interesting about the cave paintings is that there's a kind of majesty to them and a kind of mystique and a kind of mystery, both in terms of where they are in this particular cave and other cave paintings that I know of. They're situated within the cave as if the journey to the center was a kind of spiritual journey. And what's revealed in the center of the cave was relating to the mysteries of life. We can't say much about God, but we can say the mysteries of nature at this point, because there are beautiful drawings of deer and bison and human animal figures, the blending and blurring, what is human, what is animal, but certainly a kind of majesty. And the problem with archaeology is that there's a lot of guessing going on, and because the facts are just the facts, there's a drawing. And so I am interpreting a bit. But what is it? Here's my question. What is it about the human spirit that wants to take the time to mark something? In other words, to take an action that might align themselves with the sacredness of life, with the mysteries of life, with the transcendent, with the impermanent mystery of life itself, and the cycles, the patterns, the returning of animals and plants and seasons. These are some of the oldest expressions of what I think of as the beginnings of prayer that we know of. What is it about the human spirit that wants to make an action like that, that orients them to the world? I'd like to say that's something like a prayer. And maybe the second place that we discover this is in burial plots. Now, I know a lot about burial plots from the Middle East, so I'm not an expert in other parts of the world, but maybe some of you are, and that would be interesting. And what's interesting about burial sites, caves, typically, especially in the Middle East, is that sometimes you'll get everyday objects, cooking pots, lamps, depending on the time period, and often figurines of some sort, maybe what might be considered little gods or goddesses. And sometimes you'll get jewelry and beads. And again, what is it about the human spirit? Like, why not just chuck a body in a river and be done with it, or leave it in the woods, or, why orient oneself and even arrange the burial cave much like a bed? Most of them are kind of bed-like chambers. And put in their provisions. And I do not think the answer is because they all believe they need this stuff in the afterlife. There's a lovely book called Inventing Hell that's worth reading. It talks a little bit about the history of the afterlife. But it's not obvious that ancient people thought, oh, they'll need this stuff in the afterlife. Some of that with Egyptian pharaohs, but it's not obvious from most of the populations of our ancestors. I'm thinking more of the bringing some sacredness, some orientation. How do we orient ourselves to the mystery, to the transcendent? This person was here and now they're gone. And there's an honoring of that. That's partly what I mean by prayer, a posture toward life. And in this case, toward death. Other places we see it. In antiquity, they found like really hundreds of thousands of figurines. That might be a bit of an exaggeration. Let's just say thousands. Thousands of figurines that are connected to birth rites. I'm thinking now of some images of Canaanite gods. Maybe you've seen them where they have relatively wide hips. And this was a Canaanite deity. Canaan was just a region of the Middle East where modern-day Israel is and Palestine. So Canaanite is kind of a general term. It just means the people of Canaan. And it seems among various tribes and various religions, there were these figurines, which is, why would you need these figures in your home that seem to be connected to birth rites? Because birth and death are dangerous things, of course, you could say. And you could say, oh, well, they're, the old, a monotheistic critique would be, oh, they're worshiping idols and they think they're going to help them. But that's part of the point of what I'm saying. A posture of prayer is aligning oneself to the divine, to the transcendent. And as best they could understand it, the feminine goddesses were there to help with the birth of things. Somehow the great mother is involved in the mysteries here. And how do I align myself to her rhythms, to her flow? How do I align myself? And these little figurines were in part an act of prayer in my mind. I don't think I'm making that up either. I think I'm as a physical act meant to align oneself with the transcendent, to honor it, to bring sacredness to this most precious moment. So, and maybe I should say something about ritual objects in general, because they're all over the place. There were ritual objects connected to the God of the Hebrews. There are ritual objects connected to every other deity in the ancient world. There are ritual objects connected to other deities in other parts of the world. What is it that they thought was taking place? And it seems to be something like this. I got this from one of my professors in graduate school. He said, you have to understand that ancient people were more sophisticated than modern people tend to think. Modern people tend to think, oh, they're idols, and they think a little god lives on their, next to their little fire pit, how silly of them. But actually, that's probably not what was happening at all. I think the thinking is probably more something like this, that the god, the force, inhabited a certain place, often a geographical place, and by bringing in a sacred object into the home or into a temple or something like that was to invite the presence of the deity in a kind of unique way. Not that it could be contained there, but just to invite the presence of the deity in a unique way. And that's partly what I'm saying here as an act of prayer, like aligning oneself with the transcendent. Now, you might argue, if you want to be a theologian, well, they had the wrong ideas about God, or they had the wrong God, or so forth and so on. Okay, fine. But I'm talking about the action, the orientation here, the posture. So, of course, people put up little figurines, because whatever the gods were, or the god, or the goddesses, man, life is full of trouble and difficulty and chance and beauty and sacredness. So I'd like to engage in a conversation with the mysteries that are beyond me. So that explains a little bit of ritual objects. This is my brief history of prayer. The next sort of ground I'd like to cover, no pun intended, is sacred sites. So before there were temples, almost every ancient group that we know of I'm saying almost because maybe there's an exception. Every ancient group that I've ever studied or bumped into, there's some kind of sacred site. That place mattered. And if you brought yourself to the place and oriented yourself to the place, this was a physical act of prayer. I want to go visit Ra in his, well, in this case, Ra is the sun god, and the temples were aligned with the sun. So that's maybe not the best way of explaining it. Let's just take local trees or hills or rivers or caves. These were the earliest sacred sites that we know of. And what's interesting about them, sort of kind of philosophically, at least in my mind, in terms of the development of religion, is that there was an association with a physical place and the presence of whatever the god was. So if it's a cave, if it's a river, if it's a mountaintop, if it's a tree, if it's a grove, okay, the god lives here or dwells here in a certain way. And how do I align myself to this God, to this being, to this deity, or to the place? Another way of saying it is to the natural rhythms of things, to the mysteries of the mountain and of the river. I mean, without the river, there's an acknowledgement by the community that we all die. So how do we orient ourselves prayerfully toward this mystery of the flow of life? That's what I mean. Let's not use a kind of contemporary arrogance to say, bunch of idiots back then worshiping rivers. I don't think that's exactly what was happening. I think it was an orientation toward the sacred. And that's a form of prayer. Now, out of sacred sites, we have temples. So essentially, temples, well, most of them that we know of from ancient times were built on sacred sites. So it was like, okay, not enough. Not enough to just have a forest. That's where the god dwells. We can't have people just wandering in there. So let's build a fence around the forest, or let's build a fence around the tree, or let's build a fence around a mountain, or let's build a fence around part of a river. All of this stuff is how temples originated, because there was a sense of there are mysteries beyond our capacities to explain them, and we need to approach them with a kind of prayerful posture. So we need a sacred site, we need a temple, we need a building, and we need eventually professionals. Because again, nice of you to show up, but you can't just wander in here. You know, you gotta purify yourself, and you have to make certain offerings. And of course you see the development of something like prayer. Okay, I'm going to approach the God. I'm going to have a certain posture. And now it's a little bit more organized. And ancient temples were very common. They originally, before they got very elaborate, were basically model houses, but slightly bigger. So whatever your local house was, the temple was simply a house that was a little bit larger. Benches, rooms, a place where you ate, meals, sacrifices. It's an exaggeration of the home. It's an idealization of the home, really. So not only do I have my home where I dine and eat and my friends come, but then I dine and eat with the God in the presence of the priest who will help organize things so it's not so chaotic, and I can be, again, orient myself in right relationship to the transcendent. That's a temple, and it's a form of prayer. It's physical. It's an action. There's a lot of contempt. It kind of comes from Protestantism, and in some ways it's a return. But there's like, oh, we don't need temples, we don't need buildings, we don't need churches, we don't need walls. God is everywhere, you know. And in a sense, ancient people thought the same thing as well. But if God is everywhere, sometimes it's like, well, then God is nowhere, you know. I'm at Starbucks and that's my church. I think, no. It doesn't strike me as an intentional action taken by an individual to align oneself in relationship to the divine or the transcendent. That's just ordering a latte and liking the color scheme. Anyway, so maybe we shouldn't be so quick to dismiss buildings and places, the geography of things. Maybe I don't want to say too much more there, because I did promise that this would be a brief history. But maybe I should just talk about the development of professionals here. Professional prayers. And that's the priesthood. So as religions, ancient religions began to organize themselves and eventually build houses, which later were called temples, and those temples got bigger, and as kingdoms got bigger, there's a blurring between king and God now. And here you have the massive temples, like in Egypt or Mesopotamia, or the Hittite temples, or even those in Israel. They weren't as massive, but they're large nonetheless, because there's a little bit of blurring between empire and God at this point. But you needed a professional priesthood, because after all, not only is it important for you personally to have some kind of orientation, some kind of prayer life, but you got stuff to do. And who's going to represent the community as a whole? Who's going to represent the kingdom? Who's going to represent the empire? And the professional priest was born into the world, where they're doing on behalf of the community what the community can't maintain. Let's say there's a fundamental belief that I need to align myself with the divine, with the mysteries, but I got, seeds to plant. Who's going to do that for me? Well, the priest will. He'll do it every day. And his actions will be the actions needed for not only me, but for the entire community. They're sort of stand-ins. They pray on behalf of. That's really the conception of the ancient priest, which actually brings me just not to an aside, but just to a comment about sacrifice. Ancient people were far more concrete than we are today, especially when it comes to theology. If you ask an ancient person, what's a prayer? They might say, go get my goat, I'll show you. It's action. It's concrete rituals. It's eating food, dining. Those were forms of prayer. And the sacrifice was probably the most visceral. And for some reason, modern people they like, oh, sacrifice. How could they do that? How could they cut up animals? And they're arguing about this over like their burger at Culver's, So it's like, We've sanitized and whitewashed our relationship with death, but ancient people were much closer to it. And they said, if I'm going to take the life of something, and that's going to sustain me, I better do it in right relationship to the whole cosmos, to the gods, who must be sustaining this cosmic mystery in the first place. So I'm not just going to hack an animal to death and eat whenever I want. No. Some of the animals will be set aside, and we'll butcher the animals in a sacred manner. The priest will help us with it. It will be divided up equally, and we'll have an outdoor barbecue. That's all ancient sacrifice was the 4th of July with a lot more sacredness. Maybe for you, the 4th of July is sacred. I don't know if you've been out on a lake or a river lately in Michigan for the 4th of July. I wouldn't exactly call that sacred. Just my opinion. Correct me if I'm wrong. Okay. Maybe that's as much as I want to do with a brief history. Oh, no, it's not. It's not. I'm sorry. One more piece and then I'll wind it down. So, a major cataclysmic shift happened in the evolution of human consciousness. And that cataclysmic shift had to do with a little tiny reed and dried animal skin and ink. And that is the written word. For most of human history, whatever we thought of prayer was mostly actions that were concrete. With the invention of writing, things began to shift because, of course, with those concrete actions came songs, came dance. I really didn't talk about dance. Dance is a whole other way of exploring prayer that should not be minimized, but is on par with everything that I just said. So dance, singing, songs, words, things like that. Once writing is invented, that stuff starts to get concretized. And what was spontaneous at one point becomes formalized. And we can't have each generation of priests just riffing, freestyling, jazz, up there with their little prayers. No, we need to write them down. We need to formalize them. If they've worked in the past, if they've helped us, if they've helped the community, if they've helped individuals, if it's been seen and understood and felt to be a kind of real conversation between God and the community or the person, we better write these down. And there's a shift that begins to happen with prayer that goes from action to word. And when we finally get to things like Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, it's almost impossible to separate out action and text anymore. It's text, word, formalization of words, the Psalms, the Lord's Prayer, plus postures and actions like making the sign of the cross or kneeling in Islam, or in Judaism, moving and flowing with the prayers like the Hasidic people do, and other Orthodox Jews, but concretized in words. And then the words need to be protected and formalized. And you can see what started off probably with more spontaneous actions in the forest gets more and more narrow and more specific. And I'm not saying this is bad. I just think it's maybe one step forward and one step backward, or two steps forward and one step backward, or who knows exactly. But there's a shift to word. So text and body and form are kind of merged. What should I say? Text. How should I approach body? What's my body like? What posture? And what form? What places? These all become part of the conversation around prayer. So I think I want to pause here because there's probably a lot more to say, but I might pick up on at least some of the textual stuff in future talks about prayer. I just want to mention some themes that I think that came out of this brief kind of drive-through of prayer here. So here are themes that maybe help fill out my original definition. Prayer, at times, seems to contain spontaneous moments of inspiration. I think that's the cave painting. That's Psalm 23, just coming out of the mouth of David. Spontaneous acts of art, drawing, painting, dancing. Inspiration means to be inspirited. So that seems to be an expression of prayer, one that's kind of much more personal than communal. The second thing that I think is a theme that's sort of in the background of this brief history is that there seems to be an orientation toward humility, that we can't just march in, we can't just treat death or birth or our crops or our meals with such flippancy. There needs to be a sense of humility. Prayer, I think, any way you put it, contains seeds of humility. I think maybe I would even say it should, something like that. It's definitely a theme. Another theme that comes out of this brief history is that prayer is geographical, which is very interesting. It's like, okay, how am I in relation to a place on earth? That's a form of prayer. What's here? Where does the water go? What are the seasons like? What's the winter like? What's the summer like? What happens when nature is out of balance? What happens if I cut all the trees down? These kinds of things. These were actually came out of being in relationship to a specific place. Think how rarely the modern person thinks about prayer that way, How do I relate to the place I'm inhabiting on earth? That was a form of prayer in antiquity. It's a theme. I already mentioned something about buildings. Maybe the final theme is once we get closer to more of what we might think of as formalized religion or institutional religion, there's a combination of text and body and form that's happening, which I said a few minutes ago. Text, body, and form, and they're kind of in conversation. The text, the words, the body, the posture, and the form or the container or the place, the packaging, that seems to be around the question of how to pray. You have that with chanting as well. Moving outside of in Hindu tradition or yoga can be seen as a form of prayer. And the question would be because these are old, text, body, and form. what's happening here, if we want a fuller understanding of how prayer is being approached. Okay, that's as far as I want to go today in my brief history. I hope you heard something that you disagree with, that you found interesting, that you want more clarification on. Join us for Talkback. You can also, make comments on Facebook. I'm not that great at looking at the comments. I'll just be honest about that. But sometimes other people do. And sometimes an interesting exchange can take place here. So I want to end how I began, which is back to Mary Oliver. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. But I do know how to kneel. And that's actually a longing of mine. I'd like to learn how to kneel better in my life. I'll see you next week.